Heard some big picture thoughts about where the world's going. We've gotten pretty deep in a particular technology of artificial intelligence. You know, when you look at what's happening in the world right now, there's four big tech things happening: social, mobile, cloud, and big data. And we're going to touch on all of those here. We heard, quite a bit about mobile already. One thing we're going to hear right now is a lot about big data from Rick Smolan, who's one of the great journalists about what's happening. He's a photographer, but he's become a journalist of mass experience. He did all the 24 hours in the life of books, and now he's focusing on the human face of big data. I think you're going to find it really elucidating. So please, Rick, take it away.
Thanks, David. So I probably have one of the best jobs in the world. Every 18 months, I get to invite my heroes and my peers and some young photographers, and I get to send them off on these sort of crazy Mission Impossible assignments. I wanted to tell you about our latest adventure, and the great thing about being a journalist, as David and I both know, is that you get to go into areas you know nothing about, and you get some of the smartest people in that area to actually spend time and educate you. And then hopefully along the way, you get to sort of share your journey with a larger audience. So I'm going to give you sort of a quick history of our projects and then talk specifically about the world of big data. And it's been probably the most interesting year I've spent. I have a small group of friends. We get together about every 18 months. We bring in teams of journalists around the world. We do books and CD-ROMs and TV shows. And we basically sort of focus on this idea of what happens over a defined period of time. I had the idea many years ago as a young photographer of inviting all my heroes and peers and friends to get together, and I got turned down by every publisher in the world with this day in the life concept, who told me it was the stupidest thing they ever heard of. There was no market for coffee table books. So I went to private companies and begged for resources. I went to Steve Jobs and begged for computers. I went to Kodak and begged for film. I went to Qantas Airlines and begged for airline tickets. And one of the things I've always said to these companies is that I'll thank you in the book, but we don't do product placement. We're completely an independent group of journalists. After doing the Day in the Life books, I thought, what if you took that same concept, and instead of a country and a day, you did a deep dive on emerging topics, like the first year the internet was starting to touch humanity, or the global water crisis, or how the human race is learning to heal itself. One of the things that never occurred to me is that when you invite photographers and writers and editors from the world's leading publications, I sort of stumbled backwards into this amazing sort of publicity. All of a sudden, all the people working on our projects were helping tell the story of what we had learned. And so not only was it a book, but suddenly we had a worldwide audience to tell this story in lots of different mediums. The died and gone to heaven moment was the following, and that's the last thing I'll show you about our history.
I found my next favorite thing one day when I was just going through the bookstore. One of my favorite things to do is to go to the bookstore. Y'all heard? Okay. So I found this book. It is a great gift. It's called America 24/7. It is from New York Times, #1 best-selling authors, Rick Smolan.
So anyway, so that it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, that's your died and gone to heaven moment in publishing. So a year ago, I was at the TED conference, and I love going to conferences. I ran into Marissa Mayer. And we were talking about next projects, and she was asking, what are you going to work on next? She's been an incredible friend and a wonderful supporter of these projects when she was at Google. And she said, if I was you, I'd take a look at this world of big data. And I said, what's big data? And I'd actually been hearing other people at the conference talking about it as well. And one person I asked about big data, they said, oh, it's so much data it doesn't fit on your personal computer. And I said, no, okay, it doesn't sound very interesting. And then the next person said, no, it's different data sets from lots of different organizations overlapped, and you look for these patterns. I said, I'm a photographer. I don't really get this. And Marissa was the one that actually said, Rick, the planet is growing a nervous system, and we're all helping that happen. And we've all become sort of human sensors on this global emerging network. And it's a little bit sort of along the lines of what Ray was just talking about. And I thought, okay, that's really interesting. She actually gave us our first 5 assignments. One of the things that Marissa did is she pointed me to this wonderful quote by Eric Schmidt. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a programmer. I'm not from the world of technology. I know nothing about. I have no idea what an exabyte is. But when she showed me this quote, it gave me this sense of the magnitude of all of this. I also then saw another quote, which I thought was pretty interesting, which is the cost now of sensing things, of measuring things, of collecting the data is plummeting. So now we have the ability to collect the data, process it, visualize it, and then change our behavior while we're still collecting the data. And then finally, Esther Dyson was the one that mentioned to me Again, I get to talk to all these wonderfully, incredibly smart people that have taken the time to sort of educate me along the way, is that now these devices are actually generating more data than we are, and they're starting to change their behavior, and we're no longer the center of the data conversation, which is pretty interesting. Now, the way that the media was covering this story until about 6 months ago is the moment you heard the word big data, you always heard it followed by Big Brother. And there's no question, also as Ray said, that every new technology comes with it the possibility of being misused. But it reminds me of the early days of the internet when people were saying, what's this internet thing? It's like email with pictures. It's a better way to deliver pornography. It's like, yeah, it is. But it probably does some other things pretty well, too, as we've discovered over the last 20 years. My son is 10 years old, and he hears me all the time on the phone talking to people and interviewing people about big data. And about a month ago, he came up to me and said, Dad, every time you're on the phone, I hear this big data thing, big data. What is big data? So I'm thinking, oh, God, how do you tell a 10-year-old what big data is? And I was like struggling for an analogy, and I said, Jesse, imagine if your whole life you've been looking through one eye, and all of a sudden, for the first time in your life, you were able to open up a second eye. You're not just getting more data. You're not getting more vision. You're getting a new dimension of it. And he said, is that what computers do? I said, exactly. He said, well, could a computer open up a third eye and a fourth and 1,000 eyes? You know, if you're 10 years old, 1,000 eyes is really cool. And I said, yeah, I mean, that's exactly what computers are doing. So let me show you some of the things we discovered. We try to look at as many different areas of human endeavor as possible. I'm going to talk very quickly because I've only got a few more minutes, and this story is literally turned out to be the most interesting thing I've ever been working at. We sent 100 journalists around the world to 30 countries to look for stories, to collect stories, to take photographs of big data. My brother's a filmmaker, and he said, Rick, when you open up your books, start them the way I start a movie, like grab the audience. So here's a couple of big thoughts, and this is, look, all of you here in this audience know a lot about this, but this is aimed at the general public. It's also aimed at all of you. So the amount of information that we're exposed to now in the course of a day is as much as somebody from the 15th century was exposed to in their entire lifetime. Now that's a thought you kind of go, whoa, that's amazing. I mean, just the scale of the amount of information we're dealing with. The amount of information generated during the first day of a baby's life is 70 times the information in the Library of Congress. You know how Apple has Find My iPhone? There's actually something now which is kind of like Find My Teenager. Progressive Auto Insurance will install this little black box into your car if you allow them to track your driving throughout the day, so they know how fast you're driving, where you're driving, what time of night, how quickly you change lanes. But this idea basically that everything we're doing now is being recorded forever. So if any of you are planning to run for political office, remember that none of this information will ever disappear. And obviously the effect of open data amplified by Twitter and Facebook has had enormous impact on world politics. I'm going to show you some of the specific stories in here. The day the earthquake hit last year in Japan, obviously a horrible, horrible occurrence, but I heard an amazing story on Marketplace. Kai Ryssdal told the story that 43 seconds before the earthquake hit, every bullet train in every factory in Japan stopped. And they've spent $500 million over 15 years installing an early earthquake warning system, which worked very effectively. Imagine being on a bullet train and having the ground moving like that. And then I discovered a group of programmers in Palo Alto have created something called Quake Catcher. So this is the accelerometer in your laptop to look for movement. And if it sees a truck going by your house, it knows that's not an earthquake. But if it sees over a 30-mile area, the same pattern of vibration. So you have now a free, ubiquitous, crowdsourced, global early warning system. And people are doing this just simply to help each other. It's just using the power of their computers. In the South Pacific, a group of scientists are actually putting sensing devices on animals like elephant seals and using them to map migration patterns. Whenever one of these animals gets close enough to one of these 60 transponders, it grabs the data, goes up to the surface, it goes up to a satellite. My kids love this story in particular. Imagine getting your American Express bill next month and there's no itemization. Would any of us ever pay a credit card bill if we couldn't see what we were spending it on? And yet we get an electrical bill every month. None of us have the faintest idea what it is that we're spending our money on. Sweetak Patel is 27 years old. It's his third startup. He's a MacArthur fellow. He's invented a little technology you plug anywhere in your house, and it recognizes the digital signature of every appliance in your house. I said, this is really cool. So is it being used yet? He said, well, it's about to be deployed, I think, by Belkin. But I said, tell me something you learned that would surprise the average American. And he said, the average American spends 11% of their electrical bill on the DVR, that little box sitting under their TV that's spinning all day long, because it doesn't spin down. So instead of drilling a new oil well or a nuclear power plant, just redesign the DVR and you can cut America's energy bill by 5%. I'm going to jump through some of these stories. This is a wonderful story of looking at data. The way most people look at crime data is they look at where the crimes are committed. Well, an organization actually is looking at where the criminals lived before they went to jail. And say, well, who cares where they live? Well, maybe since putting people in jail for 20 years doesn't appear to solve the problem, maybe if you go to where these families come from, where criminals come from, these are blocks in New York City where Mayor Bloomberg spends $1 million a year just in that one square block. Maybe this is where you put in early childhood intervention or career counseling or drug counseling. A third of the drugs in Africa are counterfeit. The last picture that was up there, it's a new technology. It lets you actually SMS a code on the back of the bottle to see if it's legitimate or not. For years, radar operators have been trying to filter out the noise from birds and bees and bats around airports so they can see the planes. A group of scientists recently said, wait a second, you've got 15 years of migration patterns of bats and birds, and you've been throwing it away. So what's so interesting is that what to one person is noise you're trying to get rid of to somebody else is incredibly valuable. The Gates Foundation and an organization called Esri. Esri is using satellite mapping to find villages in Nigeria that don't exist on any known maps. The Gates Foundation is trying to eradicate polio. So by looking at these maps, finding villages that nobody knows are there, giving out GPS-enabled cell phones, they're actually using satellites to help eradicate polio in the developing world. A group of doctors found out if you took 24 hours of your EKG, they can actually predict who's going to have a heart attack again in 2 years after you have your first heart attack. Until then, they were throwing away all the data and just looking at 30 seconds of your EKG while you're in the hospital. I'll tell you one last story. I'm just about out of time. My mom is going to be turning 90 very soon. My dad died 5 years ago, and my mother started falling about 3 years ago. After the third time she fell, no one found her for 3 hours. And so my brother and sister and I said, you know, Mom, you've got to move in with us. We can't let you live by yourself anymore. It's just too dangerous. Of course, she'd want to do that. So I hired women to live with her in shifts, which she hated. You know, they're stealing my garbage bags. I said, Mom, they're not stealing your garbage bags. Anyway, I found out that Intel and GE are working on a series of products aimed at aging at home. They have something called the magic carpet, which they install in the home of your loved one. It basically creates a pattern that says, this is how Rick's mom walks on a normal day when things are okay. On a day where suddenly her balance is off, her gait is off, or it's 11 o'clock in the morning, she hasn't touched the carpet, they notify you. So there's nobody, there's no camera, there's no invasion of her privacy. All this technology, and the whole purpose of doing this book is to actually give people a sense of how this is affecting our lives on a day-to-day basis. This is pizza delivery in New York City on a Friday night. We did some really interesting infographics by Nigel Holmes, looking at Twitter and Facebook, and all the companies are using data in really interesting ways. And I'm just going to get to the end of this, David. I'm almost there. The company that actually funded this whole project is EMC. They're the ones that made this whole project possible. They gave us a completely carte blanche to do a project. Yes, thank you, EMC. Greatly. And the other two companies I wanted to mention is Cisco's funding a documentary about this right now. But one of my fantasies was to deliver this book and put it into the hands of 10,000 of the most interesting, influential men and women in the world. So I went to FedEx. Actually, thanks, David introduced me to Rob Carter at FedEx. And FedEx on December 4th is delivering this book to world leaders, Fortune 500 CEOs, heads of media companies. And the reason is not to say that big data is going to solve all of our problems, but that right now companies and governments are thinking about big data in a really big way. And I think individuals need to be thinking about this as well. I believe that big data is going to have a much bigger effect on our lives than the internet has so far. And I wanted to help spark a global conversation. So I'm very grateful to these companies for giving us the ability to do this, to our journalists. And David, thank you so much for inviting me today.